When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd had the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this episode, we reveal how expert witnesses unlocked the secrets of unidentified bones found in Sheffield.
This was an unusual death. That death had not occurred where the package had been found by the two men.
And in Bradford, a DNA scientist examines 25-year-old evidence to solve a murder cold case.
Establishing one DNA link is useful to the inquiry team, but a number of different potential links builds a more complete case.
Sometimes forensic osteology can provide the police with critical evidence whereby a person's life has been writ on the skeleton, so to speak.
It's when you've got things in front of you and you have to interpret them, and you can see the patterns come, you can see answers coming out. That's the thrilling bit.
January 2000, Sheffield, and two men discover an abandoned sports bag on an industrial estate. Inside are human bones in layers of wrapping. Bob Story was a senior investigating officer in charge of the case.
So this location's changed somewhat since 2000 when we recovered the body. This building wasn't actually built, and this was a grass verge up the side. But the body itself was here. Well, like most police officers, I've seen several dead bodies, but none in this state of decomposition. It was almost unrecognisable as a body. It was clear that this was an unusual death. And it was also quite obvious to me that death had not occurred where the package had been found by the two men.
The level of decomposition made it impossible for the pathologist to determine a cause of death. There was just a single but inconclusive clue.
At that stage, there was a wound on the neck here, but the pathologist was unsure whether that wound was as a result of his straightening the body out or whether it was a wound that had been inflicted previously.
Police did not know how the victim died or when, and still hadn't enough evidence to even establish an identity.
The initial post-mortem was only able to give us a rough height, and that was it. So the identification from the remains of the body and what was left inside the wrappings became more and more important.
First, Bob decided to ask what more the bones could tell him, and turned to forensic osteologist and expert witness Martin Everson.
The first thing we do is start with the skull and examine certain features in the skull. We could look at the state of dental eruption. We could look at those features that can be used to assign sex and ancestry. Other than a body had been dumped in inner city Sheffield in a holdall. There was very little other information to go on at that point.
While Martin and his team began a painstaking analysis, Bob reconsidered one curious piece of evidence: a leaf found amongst the wrappings that covered the body.
The foliage that was found within the body wrappings, that was important to see if there were any clues on there. So we could build up a picture of perhaps where the body had been stored or where the body had been moved to.
To answer these questions, Bob needed the help of another expert witness. Patricia Wiltshire is an expert in analysing traces of evidence left by plant life.
If you go to a crime scene and it's predominantly one plant there, like a rhododendron, you know that if you get someone that's covered in rhododendron pollen, which is insect pollinated, probabilistically, they've been somewhere where there's a rhododendron. So that's actually valuable. But more often than not, you're looking at assemblages, the groups of plants that are all growing together, and you go from there.
Bob hoped Patricia's analysis of the leaf found among the wrappings that covered the victim's body would unlock clues to where they had been murdered and when.
I got this leaf and it was yellowing. It had fallen off the tree naturally. The clues from that leaf allowed us to say that the body was probably wrapped up in the autumn. So that gives some timeline to the police.
Bear in mind the body had been discovered in January. It had obviously been concealed until the autumn of 1999, which helped us establish a time frame for the movement of the body from where it had originally been concealed.
Next, Patricia searched for clues to where the victim had been wrapped up and began by analysing the species of pollen covering the surface of the leaf.
I did palynology of this leaf, and lo and behold, what came out was a really neglected garden. And I said, the body has been near something like a clematis and a rose, and there's probably a sycamore tree there.
This information was a start, but nowhere near enough to pinpoint where the victim had been moved from or killed.
Professor Wiltshire was actually able to give us the species of plants that the foliage had come from, but they weren't unique to any particular area.
Meanwhile, however, Martin Everson's analysis of the bones was revealing clues to the victim's identity.
So in the dentition, there were signs of periodontal disease. The individual may have been chewing some sort of thing, wearing the dentition away mechanically, but also eroding or dissolving it chemically. Something like tobacco, but we had a hunch that this may have been somebody chewing cat.
Cat is a plant grown in Yemen and parts of North Africa and commonly chewed as a stimulant. Perhaps the victim was from one of these communities. Martin spotted another clue in the bones of the arm.
There was an olecranon spur, which is a little spur of bone where the triceps muscle at the back of the arm inserts into the back of the elbow, diagnostic of hand-arm vibration syndrome, which arises in people that work on vibrating mechanical equipment.
So the victim had chewed cat and worked with machinery. There were also indications of injuries and other health conditions.
There was evidence of surgical intervention in the metatarsophalangeal joints, the big toe joints. Sherman screws had been inserted to treat hallux valgus, or bunions, and there'd been a subsequent operation where one of these screws had been removed. So we had a wealth of information about this individual, but we couldn't be entirely sure what the cause was of all these changes or features.
We're building up this picture of the body and the profile of the person. We could go to hospitals and ask, did you do this operation? But But that's not quite as simple as it seems, because there were actually literally thousands and thousands of operations carried out like this across the country.
The investigation was stalling, but Martin had an idea. He asked his students at Sheffield University to reconstruct the victim's facial features based on the skull.
Facial reconstruction is really an artistic process with a limited scientific basis, but it's not usually anticipated to produce something where we might call it an exact likeness, but it might be where somebody would recognise the individual, particularly if they knew they were missing.
It was a long shot, but the investigation was running out of options. The completed model at least allowed them to appeal to the public for help.
So we went to Crime Watch and we went to the local and national newspapers with a view to getting the coverage as wide as possible. And at that stage, it really was becoming the last throw of the dice. Because if we didn't get the body identified, there was a big possibility that we would have to close the inquiry down and we'd never know what happened to this particular person.
The Crime Watch appeal produced nothing, but the appeal in the local paper did. Finally, they had a promising lead.
We got a call from a member of the public who was quite definite. It wasn't a thought. The person said, "That is Mohammed Nasser Ali. It was from Sheffield, and he hadn't been seen for about 4 years."
75-year-old Mohammed Nasser Ali had worked in a cutlery factory and was once a prominent member of the local Yemeni community.
I think when we got an ID, we felt incredibly elated, really. It felt like a fabulous success. And then the man's medical records came back, and we were able to link what we'd found on the skeleton to the man's life history.
And as the investigation unfolded, all the issues that we looked at in terms of the forensic evidence actually fitted together really well.
And we could confirm that he was born in Yemen and brought up in Yemen, and that he may well have chewed cap, had indeed had operations for the treatment of hallux valgus on both feet, and that he'd gone back to have one of the screws, the Sherman screws, removed. We also were able to learn that he'd worked in the Sheffield cutlery industry for many years as a buffer. That's somebody that polishes cutlery, and therefore it's likely that he may have got hand-arm vibration syndrome, causing his olecranon spurs, and that he may have got hallux valgus or bunions in both feet as a consequence of using the pedals on a mechanical polishing machine.
Everything pointed to the victim being Mohammed Nasser Ali. His family had never reported him missing. But when police carried out a search of his home, they found his blood in the house and in the cellar. Detectives immediately questioned his son, Hassan Nasser, and his grandson, Kassan Mohammed, and it was the grandson, Kassan, who made a chilling confession.
Because of the pressure of the investigation and where he found himself. So Kassan told us that his father had actually slit his grandfather's throat at their address at Palmer Street. And that was as a result of an argument over money.
The grandson's confession made it clear that the motive for the murder was so that his father, Hassan, could sell Mohammed's house and keep the proceeds.
And another facet of that was that Kassan and Hassan had been drawing from the grandfather's accounts and pensions throughout the 2 years that he'd been dead.
They were both charged with murder. The police had a confession, but confessions can be withdrawn. It was crucial to the prosecution to be able to prove the case forensically. So Patricia Wiltshire travelled to the victim's house. She needed to confirm that the plants in the garden there were a match for the pollen on the sycamore leaf.
And I remember going to the garden and it had been trashed. But what I did find, right next to the back door, a little tiny backyard with a back door, and right there was a clematis and a rose that had been climbing up the fence and had been cut back, but there was enough there to recognise them. And the sycamore leaf from the sycamore tree at the bottom of the garden, the clematis and the rose there, and other garden plants on that leaf clinched it, really.
Patricia's evidence also answered a question that had bothered Bob's story since the beginning of the investigation. Why had the body been moved?
In terms of the foliage that was found in the body wrappings, Pat Wilshire had said that they'd been shed the previous autumn, and that coincided when they wanted to put the house up for sale, because they didn't want the body left there because somebody could have found it. That's when the foliage from the trees had dropped into the body wrappings, and Pat was able to identify that for us.
The corroboration of Martin and Patricia's evidence, combined with other forensics, was enough to nail the case. The two men were convicted of murder.
Both men pleaded not guilty, so it was important that all that forensic evidence that we'd collected built up the picture. The jury was left in no doubt that both men were guilty, and the basic motive for that was nothing other than greed.
Every time I do a case, I'm always surprised about the learning curve. It's still steep. You learn something every time. This is why every case is unique. I'm surprised at how much information I got from so little.
It was absolutely fascinating to find the links. The manner in which a body is disposed of, concealed, buried, will always tend to leave a trace on the skeleton.
Hassan Nasser and Kassan Mohammed were both sentenced to life in prison.
They knew that that would be a quiet area where they could throw the body out and leave it. And they never thought that because of the badly decomposed state of that body, that they would ever get found out.
From the portrayal of forensic cases on television, it can often be perceived that it's very easy to find DNA, but it's a painstaking process. You're constantly trying to get a breakthrough.
Bradford, August 1994. 86-year-old Amy Shepherd was attacked and killed at her home. The crime shocked the local community. It was a story that would catch the attention of local journalist David Jagger.
This is Follyhole Gardens, where Amy Shepherd lived for 14 years until she was killed. It's a quiet, leafy cul-de-sac. It's mainly populated by the over 60s, which is why what happened to Amy was so shocking, especially the viciousness and brutality of the killing. Amy Shepherd was an elderly lady who lived by herself. She was well known and well liked in the community. She was known locally as the Duchess because she always wore smart clothing and nice jewellery and was always well presented. A neighbour had gone round to Amy Shepherd's flat, and that was when her body was discovered. She had serious head injuries, neck injuries, stab wounds, and that was when her body was discovered and the murder investigation was launched.
When police examined the crime scene, they found jewellery and money missing. It looked like a burglary gone wrong, but there were no signs of forced entry. Detectives developed a theory to explain the crime.
It had clearly been committed by somebody who Amy trusted. He must have knocked on her door, talked her into letting him in, and it was then, while she was distracted, that he set about stealing jewellery, stealing cash, and it was only when we can assume that she discovered him, caught him red-handed, that was when he did what he did and took her life.
But police could not find enough evidence to bring charges, and for 22 years the case remained unsolved. Until, in 2016, detectives turned to forensic biologist Edward Jarman and asked him to re-examine the evidence.
The main challenge with the Amy Shepherd case was that it was decades old and samples taken hadn't revealed a potential offender. Back in the early 90s, DNA was still a useful tool, but it was far less sensitive and there were a lot more interpretational issues.
Police were hoping advances in DNA amplification and profiling since Amy's murder might now reveal a trace of her killer. But Edward did not have much to go on.
Amongst the evidence that was available to us were some tapings, a tea towel, Amy's cardigan, as well as some swabs and DNA extracts. With cold cases, obvious samples have often been tried before, so we're often left with the remnants. But unless you look, you're not going to find.
Edward's team began by examining the tapings, adhesive strips laid against evidence by crime scene investigators. The strips gather hairs, skin cells, fibres and other residues invisible to the naked eye. Edward hoped these 22-year-old samples might contain traces of DNA from Amy's killer.
One of the initial findings was a hair that had been found on the tapings taken from Amy Shepherd's neck. This is a photograph of the hair from which the root had been removed in 2009 and underwent DNA profiling then. We got the DNA extract from that sample, which we then did modern-day profiling on.
Edward's analysis revealed the first significant lead in the case in 22 years.
We never quite know what result we're going to get from a sample, but we revealed far more information that had been obtained previously and a profile that we could search the national database with.
The database showed the DNA belonged to Raymond Kay. He had been questioned at the time of the killing, when police suspected him of Amy's murder. But there was never enough evidence to make an arrest.
Raymond Kay's a career criminal. He's been in and out of prison since he was a child for all manner of crimes, mainly theft, burglary, robbery. At the time of Amy Shepherd's death, Raymond Kay was doing community service, delivering Meals on Wheels to vulnerable elderly residents, one of whom was Amy Shepherd.
A single strand of hair was not enough to prove Kay was the killer. Edward needed to find further DNA evidence. The problem was, much of the DNA recovered from the tapings was indecipherable.
Establishing one DNA link is useful to the inquiry team, but establishing a number of different potential links builds a more complete case.
All the evidence was covered in Amy's own DNA. That makes isolating a sample from the killer very difficult. So Edward used 16 years of training and a new analytical technique to focus only on the male DNA.
So it's another form of DNA analysis. I mean, it's often used when there may be a huge amount of female DNA. It allows you to target just the male DNA in the sample. So it's coming into far more routine practice with sexual assault evidence.
The process works by looking for examples of the Y chromosome, which is only found in male DNA. Edward began his search on a key piece of evidence, the murder weapon.
This was a tea towel that was thought to be used as a ligature. We had tapings from this that we undertook profiling upon.
The analysis revealed another clue.
Two of the samples suggested that Raymond Kay may have contributed a small amount of DNA.
It was still not conclusive proof Kay was the killer, but for the police, the results helped to build the case against him.
Often the public will think the DNA is the answer to all the questions, but it's more a case of trying to find a potential source of the DNA, then interpreting the results that you've established and then putting those into context within the case itself and what it actually means. Because it's often more not whose DNA it is these days, but how that came to be wherever it was located.
Edward next applied the same precision technique to identify male DNA on swabs taken from Amy's body at the time of the original investigation.
A wide profile had been established from one of the samples from Amy Sheffield, and at that time it was an unknown source. We again did some further work on those samples and established a full profile that matched Raymond Kay.
Police knew Raymond Kay was known to Amy Sheffield, that he had access to her flat, and that he had a history of violence. But for over 2 decades, this wasn't enough to charge him with her murder. Now, Edward had provided them with brand new evidence, a complete DNA profile of one of Kay's hairs found on Amy's neck, traces of his DNA on a tea towel used to strangle her, and his DNA on her body. At last, detectives could arrest Raymond Kay.
After police had matched his DNA to what was found at the crime scene, officers went to his house to interview him about the incident, and when police knocked on his door and asked him about a crime that had happened more than 20 years ago, he said, "Are you joking?" He seemed to think that this crime which he'd committed a quarter of a century ago, he was going to get away with for the rest of his life, and he was never going to face the consequences for what he'd done.
Raymond Kay was brought to trial in 2019. He was found guilty and sentenced to a minimum of 17 years for Amy's murder. The forensic evidence gathered by Edward Jarman 22 years after the crime was essential to the conviction.
As a forensic scientist, I think you have to have a lot of determination, be very thorough with your examinations, and have a good, sound understanding of the science behind it so you can present it in an objective fashion. Samples taken from a crime scene may not seem useful at the time, but may reveal their secrets decades later.